Fabulous to be introduced as a data geek. I certainly hope I don't let you down on that front or any other. Thank you very much for the invitation to talk today. I am just going to share a few slides as I talk, if I can. Okay, so I'm going to try and talk for certainly no more than 15 minutes, hopefully a little bit less, about the economic impact of coronavirus in Oxfordshire. And I know, my brief for this was, I know that a lot of the people on this call have been doing some work to kind of try and address the immediate impacts of coronavirus. So my talk is trying to think a little bit beyond, I guess, the immediate impacts of coronavirus and what might happen in the future and the sort of issues that we might face. So as Adrian says, I'm from the Department of Social Policy and Intervention at Oxford University. I'm a researcher and a lecturer there. And my interests are in kind of income inequality between places and poverty and housing and population change. Some of you may know me from a previous life where I worked for 10 years as a social statistician for Oxford City Council before I headed off into academia. So I've got a long affiliation with Oxford and Oxfordshire, and it's a pleasure to be back here to be talking about it again. Okay, so let's just kind of lay out the land. So I guess the first thing to say is that this has been an extremely tumultuous decade or so. We've had two global crises, the global financial crisis in 07-08, and then the coronavirus pandemic of 2020-21. And in between those two things, we've had a national political crisis of Brexit in the middle as well, which, whatever you think of Brexit, has eaten up a lot of political capital, seen off two prime ministers, seen a referendum and two general elections, all fought around that issue. So it has been really quite an incredible period of history that we've lived through here and are living through. Social outcomes over this period have not been very rosy at all. Of course, we've kind of lived through a period of austerity and fiscal consolidation with lots of spending cuts in the public arena. But in terms of actual outcomes, there have been, two particularly striking things that have occurred over this period. So there was the very slow recovery from the global financial crisis and very slow recovery of household incomes and wages during that period. So, the rate of growth in wages over the 2010s was, the lowest that had been seen for a very, very long time. And secondly, in terms of health, we've seen a complete slowdown in improvements in mortality rates in the UK, such that actually for women living in the poorest areas in the UK, life expectancy has actually fallen over the last 10 years, which is again something that we haven't seen for a long time. So the coronavirus pandemic, I guess, really comes on top of, a really a tumultuous period and in some ways quite a difficult period, for the UK. Coronavirus itself has obviously had very wide health, social, and economic impacts. Obviously, the number of people who have died. On top of that, the number of people who are suffering long-term complications, even if they survive coronavirus, the social impacts of long periods of isolation, as well as the economic impacts that I will focus on today. And most of these, although we kind of started out with some rhetoric at the start of the coronavirus pandemic about all being in it together, and in many ways we were all confined to home and so forth. Actually, the impacts, as we've seen, have been really unequally distributed by age, sex, class, ethnic group, and by place. So there's all sorts of things that could be talked about, but there's three things that I'm going to focus on today. I'm going to talk about employment, about housing, and about incomes from social security. Okay, so in terms of employment, You've just seen a version of this chart from Adrian. The impact on claims that are made for unemployment benefit, universal credit, as it's now called, was really dramatic. So you can see here that this is the number of claims just across Oxfordshire, and that big tip up is between March and May 2020, where the number increased from around about 7,000 to more like 17,000, just in a period of a couple of months. It was really dramatic. An incredible increase in a very short period of time. And this is something that's been sustained as well. You can see from this chart, it's fallen a little bit over that period, but really it hasn't fallen very much since May of 2021. So that's 8 months now. This also hides lots of other stuff that's going on. It obviously hides people who are on the furlough scheme, but I'll talk about some numbers on that in a moment. But it only includes people who have wanted to make a claim for unemployment benefit, and are also kind of willing and able to look for work. So there'll be people within who have lost their jobs who for whatever reason don't want to claim unemployment benefit, and so there'll be an additional number of people on top of this that we don't see in the numbers. These kind of increases have been seen across different groups for both men and women. There was a slightly higher increase for men claiming unemployment benefit than there was for women, but traditionally men have been more likely to claim unemployment benefit. And in terms of age, you can see again that the increase in claims for unemployment increased across all age groups that we have data on in Oxfordshire. You can't quite tell it from this chart, but actually there are some slightly different patterns in terms of the rate of increase across different age groups. So 16 to 24-year-olds make up the smallest absolute number of claimants for unemployment benefit, but they actually, in proportional terms, saw the largest increase in claims. So in terms of the furlough scheme, here's what we know at the moment. So at the peak of the furlough scheme last year, an enormous proportion of employments were furloughed. So over a quarter of all employments in Oxfordshire were furloughed at that point. So that was nearly 95,000 employments. There was a reasonable kind of even geographic distribution across the county, a slightly higher rate in Cherwell district. And then the latest data we have on this now is up to November of 2020, where that had fallen to 11% of employments that were furloughed, so 37,000. Again, still with Cherwell with one of the slightly highest rates, but broadly a kind of even geographic distribution. And differently to claims for unemployment benefit, the take-up of the furlough scheme amongst women was actually slightly higher than for men, which is, as I say, different to the take-up for unemployment benefit. So we don't actually know at the moment, we don't have reliable figures about what has happened in this latest kind of post-Christmas lockdown. I think we can expect that number of employments that have been furloughed will have increased again. But this kind of 11% figure is kind of was the kind of lowest it got essentially over this period. So still, in the least restrictive point of the coronavirus restrictions, still about 1 in 9 employments were furloughed in the county. And just to kind of make the point, I guess, if we go back to this slide here, we can see that in terms of unemployment benefit, there's about kind of 16,000 people currently claiming unemployment benefit, but there are 37,000, or probably more than that now, but there were in November 37,000 people on furlough. So if a proportion, if even a relatively small proportion of those furloughed employments end up becoming people who are unemployed, then there's potentially another very large increase in unemployment coming down the track. In terms of kind of who's on furlough, we don't have very good local data on this. We've got data for the southeast and for the countries. We don't have ideal data locally, but nationally we know that the take-up rate is higher for 18 to 24-year-olds, so it's 18% compared to 14% at national average. And I guess will not be a surprise. In the southeast, we know that over half of employments are accounted for by just 3 sectors, so hospitality, wholesale and retail, and arts, entertainment and recreation. Perhaps not a surprise, given that we know that those have been subject to the most significant restrictions. So just kind of looking ahead at the employment picture, as Adrian's already said, really, the extent of job losses are really unclear at the moment. The furlough is freezing a portion of the labour market as at March of 2020, and we don't know what the labour market in those sectors is going to look like, in later on this year when things start to be, restrictions start to be released. The uncertainty, the outlook is uncertain for retail, hospitality and arts and entertainment. I think we all hope that a lot of that will return, and it will return to the same extent as it did before. Certainly there's, I think, a lot of pent-up demand for meeting up and getting back out to concerts and down to the pub and all of that. But to what extent that will really be possible, and to what extent people will be willing to do that, we don't know. And I think in Oxford and Oxfordshire in particular, there's also the question of the international tourist market as well. I think we can probably see a big uptick in the domestic tourism market, but in Oxford in particular, it has a massive kind of visitor economy that is much larger than the domestic population can sustain. And so if there's if there's large reductions in international visitors, you can see that hitting Oxfordshire, those sectors in Oxfordshire, perhaps harder than it might hit other places in the country. Obviously, there's been a particular impact on young people. So that's both in terms of educational opportunities that then so for people now who are kind of suffering in their education, that later down the line might impact on their labour market opportunities, on the jobs that they can get. But also for young people in the labour market right now, some of them have had a very damaging start to their career, and may need additional support, or may suffer very long-term scarring. One thing I didn't say is that in terms of the kind of geographic patterns of unemployment, it is very much that the neighbourhoods, the places that had high rates of unemployment before the pandemic have been hit the hardest, and so it's those places, those places perhaps least able to cope that have suffered the most, and again might need support looking forward. So 2 other things I wanted to talk about very quickly. One is, first one is housing. So as we know, in Oxfordshire and Oxford in particular, pre-pandemic, there's a very tight housing market. Lots more low-income households living in private rented housing than was previously the case. Was reduced state support for housing costs, so the kind of rate of housing benefit or local housing allowance that could be claimed for support with housing costs had been restricted since 2013, and increasingly that was losing value compared to market rents, and obviously high rates of homelessness as well. In terms of interventions that took place in the pandemic, there were mortgage holidays and a moratorium on evictions, and everyone in approach to rough sleeping, and there was a restoration of the local housing allowance that provides the state support for help with housing costs. That was restored back to market rates. So there's quite a big increase in the amount that people could claim towards their housing costs. But looking ahead in terms of housing, just to think about what might happen next. So despite this kind of increase in support for housing costs, there may be households who are really struggling with debt and rent arrears. And that could be for two reasons. One is that they haven't claimed the support to which they were entitled, but also the housing costs that can be claimed for are restricted to the kind of lower end of the market. So for households who had relatively high rental costs and were maybe claiming support with that for the first time, they may have found that actually the support that they could get didn't cover their entire housing costs, and they may have really struggled to cover their housing costs as a result. There's also a question about when the moratorium on evictions is removed, whether some households that have been struggling with their housing costs and falling into rent arrears might end up being evicted, and so we might see a large increase in people presenting themselves as homeless at that point. In terms of social security incomes then, so before the pandemic, there was a significant erosion of the state basic minimum that was available to families due to a bunch of different welfare reforms that took place that kind of reduced both the amount that people could claim and also reduced the periods over which they could claim due to a 5-week wait for universal credit and also due to sanctions. And this led to a kind of rise in child poverty, particularly with large families at particular risk. And during the pandemic, some of that was alleviated by an increase of £20 in the basic rate of universal credit and an increase, as we've seen, in the local housing allowance. But more families have been affected by what's called the benefit cap, which is an absolute limit on the total amount of state support that families can claim. And so more families have been pushed into that and consequently actually had their benefits reduced again. So looking ahead, that £20 increase is temporary. There may be a significant impact on families if that is removed. And there may also be an increase in families relying on state support if unemployment rises. Another question about whether there might be increase in disability claims due to long COVID. So I'm just about on my time now, I think. I shall just leave those there in terms of things to look ahead at. The final thing, just to finish off on saying, is that the bright spot is that actually Oxfordshire is in a strong position in many ways. Oxfordshire's economic fundamentals are very strong, and some households and businesses have done very well economically in this period. So there's a question there about how we can harness that to tackle some of these problems.